Okay, well, everybody, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to join me for a little bit of this topic. And I'm going to be talking about the Association for Quality in Audiovisual Technology and what the AV 9000 standard is. But before we delve into that, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about where I'm at and where Western Washington University is at here in beautiful Bellingham, Washington, up here in the corner of the state. And we have about 15,000 FTEs or equivalents, and we support, our small little group supports about 140 general university classrooms. If you add the departmental spaces and that in there, brings it up to over 200. I'd like to acknowledge that the university does sit on the homelands of the Lummi Nation people here. And if you ever are up in our area, please reach out to me. I'll have my contact information at the end. Love to give you a tour of the campus and show you what we do up here. So as we dive into the subject matter, what would be a talk about tech without a bunch of acronyms? So the areas I'm going to be touching on are EDID, that's Extended Display Identification Data. We'll get a little bit more into that. In HDCP issues, high definition content protection. I'd like to talk a little bit about good old fashioned audio, how we're seeing poor designs often causing problems for schools, intelligibility issues around audio. And then at the end, something I call a TED, your total equipment database. Are you even getting one? So all of these issues are covered in the standard, and I'm just going to talk about these as how you can address them using some of the checklists and that. So altogether, if you lump these up, we're ending up often with these very expensive systems that we're paying for with poor quality. So often we don't think about the cost. They're often hidden, and it's up to us as managers of these spaces to look at some of these things. Something as simple as the technician needing to come out to your site, you to schedule time for that person to be there, the room being down, some of your technicians maybe having to run around because they don't have the right passwords. If you have to get as far as redesigning it, the rework, and oh yeah, if you've ever dealt with any of this, it's the never-ending punch list, and it just goes on and on. So what I want in our short time today is you to walk away with a few things. Number one, there is a standard that does work, and it's been around for 10 years now, and this is it worked in a lot of different installations. It's improved every year. We'll talk a little bit about that later, and it can dramatically simplify your engineered AV systems procurement. And also, I like to think we're talking about, if I can real quickly address, talking about two different audiences that often can do a dance in between. At our school, if it's a big public works project, we're contracting that out, and there's a AV integrator and a designer that we'll work with. But sometimes on smaller jobs, we do it all ourselves. So a lot of these tools can be used in either camp there. So before we jump into AQAV, I just wanted to tell you how I came upon it. Back in 2014, some of the instructors that have been doing a lot of classes for Infocom, what's now known as AVIXA, I've always been a big proponent of keeping up with training in our field, and Infocom does offer, or AVIXA offers a lot of great courses. And at that time, I noticed some of the instructors I had a lot of respect for, Mario Maltese and some of the others, Melissa, Dillman, trainers of the year with this big organization. We're kind of going off and doing a new thing. And let me, if I can get this to share correctly here, let me bring up this quick little video, and we'll let Mario, the guy I was speaking about, talk about it.
Hello, I'm Mario Maltese, the Executive Director of the Association for Quality in Audiovisual Technology, or AQAV. Engineered audiovisual technology is now an over $100 billion industry. Did you know that about a third of that is wasted on defects, wrong products, poor or non-performance, rework, and service calls? Did you know that many defects never get on a punch list in the first place, and that users regularly work around these shortcomings? Can you appreciate the costs involved when those hours to correct the defects are converted to dollars? Did you also know that there is a proven solution that can avoid nearly all of that waste? Audiovisual technology has become very complicated and more challenging to design and install working systems. It's almost impossible to find one that was delivered on time and without a so-called punch list. Yet the AV buyer expects and deserves an engineered audiovisual system to be delivered on time, with no defects or punch lists, and expects it to perform as intended with no artifacts. So what new roles must the AV buyer play, and how does the AV provider successfully complete a job when dealing with such complicated systems? That's where AQAV comes in. AQAV is a nonprofit organization made up of volunteers that are dedicated to improving the quality of AV design and installation. AQAV searched outside the box to learn how other industries address similar problems and then applied these solutions to AV technology. It started with the creation of a standard with real-life metrics to serve as the defining criteria of a successful audiovisual system from the perspective of the AV buyer. These metrics are economical to perform, and they are in the form of simple checklists that address every major milestone in the development of a project to monitor and identify every defect in product, installation practices, and performance. It's just as your father taught you: when you build something, measure twice, cut once. Properly applied, the standard not only gives the AV buyer everything he expects and deserves, but it also produces many benefits to the AV provider as well. Higher profits, more repeat sales, more sales in general, and higher morale and retention. AQAV also has vital education and training programs to help companies apply the standard for both the AV buyer and the AV provider. To learn more about how you can join a quality movement and hear how many AV buyers and providers have already prospered by it, read on or view other videos in this series. Thank you.
Okay, let me get us back to our PowerPoint, and got the mic. So real quick, sometime if you are interested in this, please check out the AQAV website. A few things I'll recommend as schools. Check out one of the things you can download for free called the Discerning Questions to ask your prospective AV system providers. Some real interesting things you can use with those integrators. Certainly there's a part for your standard specifications for your university, some boilerplate that puts some of this quality questions in there, and also that poor quality calculator. That check it out; it'll really surprise you. There is a free membership for all tech managers at schools. Actually, let me qualify that. It will cost you $1. Apparently there were some bots or some issues there that the way they worked around it is going to cost you $1, but believe me, you'll get a lot for that $1. All the standards that were mentioned, the AV 9000 standards, all the checklists that I'm going to show you and all that are all part of that membership. So check that out when you have time. Okay, so there's different certifications and training that AQAV offers. but it's real important to know they're not going to train you to install a system, or they're not going to train you to design a system. They're going to make sure you're able to be an auditor, to look at, to look at a design, to look at an installation. Was it done correctly? So important things to know. So two of the certifications that I recommend, one is the CQT, Certified Quality Technician. And you can read there, it's who's it set out for. But if anybody's involved in the installations, from the technicians terminating the cables, project managers, tech managers, I recommend it. It's a 3-day course. They're still doing it even during COVID, a combination of online and some personal in-person stuff, and multiple written tests. I highly suggest, if you send somebody from your organization or you go yourself, have your CTSI. If you don't know what a CTSI, that's a certification with VIXA, Certified Technology Specialist for Installation, and the course is worth 24 RUs if you're trying to keep some certifications you already have. But this training is, it is hands-on. There's tests. Not everybody passes, so be ready for those if you pursue that. CQD, Certified Quality Designer, and that's going to get really deep into looking at the different parts of your design. And I also suggest, it's a pretty tough course. Have your chops to do a CTSD with Infocom before you hit that, because it is a lot of information to absorb in the 3 days, and it's also worth 24 renewal credits. And so let's talk a little bit about quality. We throw that term around a lot, and real simple, probably if you walked away with one simple explanation or definition for quality today, it would be conformance to requirements. If we're real clear as AV buyers on what we want and what we want it to do, what would be quality? It was conforming to that requirement. So a few of the big forefathers, if you want to say, or the founding fathers of the quality movement. Phil Crosby, he was a businessman and an author. He had a lot to do with the principle of zero defects. Joseph Duran, he was also really involved in quality movement. Quite a few books that he's written out there. And quote again from Mario Maltese there, economy of effort. And just remember, let your requirements be known so we can conform and have the people doing these things conform to them. So as we move into looking at the checklist and that, I'm going to break it down into, there's a lot of milestones. If you're involved with procuring AV systems, there's more than the 3 that I'm got on the screen here. But look, let's think of the design stage, on the paper stage, then the staging stage. What I mean by that is, if you're doing things in-house, you're getting all the equipment together, you're mocking it up, doing what you can in the shop, getting all the control programs loaded. And then the commissioning, when it's actually out in the field, that final kicking the tires, does this thing work? And I want to show real quick just one of what the checklist looks like. Again, this was free for you to get with your membership. This is from the design review. As you can see, I know it's probably hard to read a spreadsheet on this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just for you to see, they got the spreadsheet with all the different checks in here, with items that I'm going to bring out that I've found very helpful for our university. So that's the design review, the staging, very similar nomenclature for the different things, and then finally the commissioning, where we're going to go out there and check everything. So some excellent checklist. Again, I don't want to have that on the screen because I know it's hard to read that small print. So as we think about those different stages, let's think of traditional quality control. Have you ever been around, like, I worked for an electronics manufacturer years back. You know, you're building these little circuit boards that do who knows what. And it goes through the whole process. At the very end, there's somebody with the QC bench. They put it on there. Did it work? No, throw it in the bin. Somebody will work on it later. Well, we can't exactly do that with our AV systems in buildings. We have to have more what I call, or not what I call, what the industry calls quality assurance. You know, where every step along the way, you're looking at the process. It's better to catch something in the design stage. You know, let's think of things that you've probably seen. I got a boardroom with 2 presentation stations, and I want a laptop hookup over there, and I also want one over here, and ability to switch in between it. Well, if that gets overlooked by your designer and it doesn't make it into the design, wouldn't it be better to catch that at design review than when you're out there commissioning the system and you go, hey, laptop works at position 1, let's go over to position 2. And, oh yeah, that's not there. Well, that's really hard to deal with. So that's just one example of this quality assurance in play there. So I'm sure we all have our own stories that you can relate to, things that you wanted as, you know, as the buyer, but you didn't get. So let's dive into those areas I said we were going to, just because these are some overlooked but very important areas. So EDID, again, if you're not familiar with that acronym, it stands for Extended Display Identification Data. And that's that communication that happens between a source, let's say a Blu-ray player, or a computer, and a display, be it a projector or a flat screen. And it's, you know, that communication. What resolution rate do I need? What's my audio settings? What's the frequency of my scan? All those kind of things is very important that communication channel is there. And things can be set very differently. How do you want these things set? What do you want your end product to display on all your different displays? So the best way to do that is to have an EDID plan, and you address it at every stage. Design stage, this is what the designer says the EDID should be set up at. And that EDID plan, in my opinion, is as crucial as your AV flow diagram. And it addresses these things. I'm going to just show you a quick, this is just a real simple one. It's actually from the course, where, as you can see, just little notes in there. It could be said, see note 2, you know, set this to native output, or set this to copy here. So sounds simple, but it's one of those things you don't want your AV designer to forget. It makes it a lot easier for the guys out in the field who are installing this stuff. You know, again, I don't want to throw too much text at you here, but if you look at that there, it's very important that this be unambiguous, because think of the technicians, again, out in the field. They're trying to put this stuff together. Do they know what you wanted? What resolution you want on that screen? And so as long as it's covered in the design, that will save a lot of time. At staging time, they're putting this together. That's the time to find out, oh yeah, to set the EDID on my switcher, I need, I'll just say we're an Extron school. So does the technician have the latest current version of the product configuration software that Extron makes? Or if you're a Crestron house, you know, all those things that you can find out, and then the technician can look at. And then at commissioning, it should be very easy at commissioning time, because it says, yeah, the plan said they wanted this, and are we getting that? So as you can see, it just flows through, makes it easy, and prevents those, as we said earlier, punch list that goes on and on forever. Hopefully not. Okay, HDCP, high definition content protection. It's out there. We've got a design for it, and we've got a test for it. And if you're needing a system that is HDCP compliant, it's got to be every part of the chain that's got to be there. And if it's not, it'll fail. And the HDCP, what would you say, getting that certification for a product, if you're a manufacturer, it's not cheap, and it changes, and the keys that they use inside part of the firmware in there, that is not something that manufacturers take lightly. So make sure they're designing to that level. And if you're not, you go to play that high definition content protected material, and you'll get that, which we don't want that in any of our classrooms. Keep in mind that also has to do with some of your audio settings, and all those things are coming into play. And at staging and commissioning times, as they're out there checking for this, they'll be able to know, okay, these particular screens that we're sending this to, they should be showing this data. It's not going to go out perhaps to codec, because that's not going to be HDCP compliant. A little tip I've learned, you're going to be testing a lot of times with a Blu-ray, because that's definitely HDCP. And often HDCP isn't enabled during the menus and the previews and that early stuff. So be a little patient and skip into the middle of the movie and let it play for a minute, because you can be fooled. Somebody can pop in a disc and say, oh yeah, see the menu there, we're good to go, gotta go. So follow up, make sure that your systems are truly HDCP compliant. All right, I've said that enough. All right, audio. Now, audio is one of those things. I put this picture in here, old picture, just because audio's, we think we've kind of moved on. We've got bigger and new, brighter things to deal with. Audio's been figured out. And unfortunately, I'm sure everybody here that works at a facility can think of, there's one or two facilities that the mics never work right. It's always ready to go in the feedback, and just not a pretty picture. So some of the suggestions I'd like to share with you today: get your school a simple sound pressure meter, one that's got both an A and a C weighted setting. If you're not out doing this for a living, you don't have, meaning you're not charging people for this, you don't have to get a real high end one, but spend a few $100s to get a sound pressure meter, and become familiar with what some of your spaces are at. Like a quiet conference room might be down around 35 dB SPL, A weighted. And as we go up, maybe a boardroom a little bit higher. And then when you get into your classrooms, where you got foot traffic going around and, lawnmowers outside the building, that'll give you what I would call as your starting level. Know what your designer needs to design to. We've got an ambient noise level of, 45 dB. We need to be, 15 dB above that. And that's where we're going to be starting. So good investment. Get yourself a sound pressure meter if you don't have one already. Microphones. That's kind of the root of a lot of the issues that we deal with. And just some of the questions that'll be asked in the checklist. Are they properly placed? What pattern did they choose? Is it an omni? Is it a cardioid? If we're using wireless microphones, are we going to have some spectrum issues? Do you need to do a frequency sweep? Excuse me. Are they going to be having ceiling mics in there? That always scares me. And where are those at near a air handling system? And then some kind of, I won't call these basics, but some of the core fundamentals of sound reinforcement systems. NOM, number of open mics and how that affects our gain before feedback. It's a good rule of thumb. Every time I open another active live mic on a system in a room, my gain before feedback is cut in half. So, you walk into a space where they're going to have 4 panel mics all on at the same time. We got to know what we're facing there. So to understand some of those principles. And then the distance rule is very similar to the number of open mics rule. That is, every time I double the distance between my mouth and the microphone element, my gain before feedback is cut in half. But it goes the other way. Every time I get it closer, having that distance, I double my gain. So that's why you see a lot of, like in houses of worship, you see a lot of people with microphones that they're wearing, or in dance instructors, stuff like that, because man, you can get that mic where it needs to be, we'll get a lot more gain out of our systems and they'll be a lot more stable. Speaking of stability, the rooms, like we mentioned, that are never right out there, don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying we need to do some of the stuff I'm about to get into in a simple, very simple room or something like that. But for larger auditoriums, you need to have your designer do some math and show you the calculations. 2 very important terms in audio design are NAG and PAG. And PAG is our potential acoustic gain. That's what our system's capable of producing. That's our potential. We can go to 85 dB, and there's some calculations to figure that out. And then very much related to that is our NAG, our needed acoustic gain. So, you figured out how far your listeners are away from the speakers and some other characteristics of the room. And we'll be able to determine this number called our NAG. And those involve a lot of measurements or distance approximations. The distance of the speaker, the person talking, when I say speaker, to the microphone, the distance of that microphone to the nearest loudspeaker. The distance DN is a distance to that nearest listener, the distance to the farthest listener, and the distance of that farthest listener from the loudspeaker. So the concept is, if my PAG, what my potential is greater than the NAG, what I need, the system's going to operate without feedback. But if we reverse that and my potential is lower than my needed, you're going to be fighting that room for the rest of your time at that school because it wasn't designed right. So we don't have time to run through all these equations today. If you get interested in that level, please check out Shure's. Got a good video on this on their website. And so does Electrosonics, the makers of some really good wireless microphones. So check that out, but at the same time, just be aware that in some of those spaces that you think could be trouble, to have those calculations done as part of the design. Okay, some other things that are often overlooked. Talking about loudspeakers. A quick check by design review, are the speakers matching the impedance of the amplifiers that they're using in there. Another very important thing, we know we want to have a way of leveling our source inputs so that when we switch between, a DVD and the laptop and the house PC and back and forth, our levels aren't jumping on all over the place. So it's best to catch those things, of course, in the early design stages, because to put those in later is going to be difficult. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to share with you, and this is just my phrasing, watch out for the magic. You know that the output of a certain piece of equipment is balanced, and all of a sudden it's popping into an unbalanced line, or vice versa. Typically, matching up pro gear to consumer grade gear. how is that being done? And this has come up several times. Often audio is left to, I'll just be blunt with you, the new guys on the install team. And if it's not specified how that's going to happen, I've seen people take the positive, the inverting, the non-inverting, and the ground, and tie them all together with little jumpers. They didn't know, not to pick on the young guys that are doing this or inexperienced. They didn't know, but so make sure that's specific in the design. It's done in the staging, and then when you're checking this stuff, you can just do a little random check out in the field during commissioning to kind of a little sample of what they're doing. But it needs to be specified, and a lot of that is what I call manufacturer specific. Some other things, a lot of HDMI signals in our racks today. It's predominant. And how are they, if they need to tap off that audio to put it into a distribution system, how are they doing that? Is there a de-embedder, audio de-embedder needed? And what are the details on that? Almost all of our systems out there in the teaching environment are going to need to bring in some various forms of microphones into the computer. We've been specifying the ART USB preamps, PreSonus makes some good ones, but just make sure that these changes of one form of audio, be it balanced, unbalanced, or to USB, something a USB can recognize, make sure that's spelled out. And then wireless microphones. Something as simple as, what are we going to do for batteries? Can we choose a microphone that has a charging bay? Where will that charging bay live? What are we going to do if it's going to be in the drawer? Again, some of these things, just catching them at design time. I've got this big, tall charging bay. Well, that's not going to fit in that 2-rack unit drawer that you spec'd for the rack. So be aware of those. Making sure your batteries are capable of being read by the battery meter on the microphone. Is it calibrated for alkaline and not nickel metal hydrides that you're putting in there, or lithium ion? So just be aware of those things. Other things you want to be aware of, especially in large buildings where you've got a lot of microphones. You can be fooled going in one room at a time and checking for this stuff. Turn on all the microphones at once. You want to be looking out for, of course, intermodulation, stepping out, dropouts, excuse me. And also another good check is shut off those transmitters at later in your test, and look to see, are we getting a lot of noise there, and what's our threshold set at? So wireless microphone problems can be tricky bears to get through. And here we have the picture of, well, this is I don't know if you can read it, but nobody's operating the 800 megahertz range, old picture. But that S meter that I was talking about over here, making sure that your noise gates are set correctly there. There's a term called STIPA or STIPA, and this has to do with a lot of public address systems that are used for warnings of emergencies and stuff like that. They've got to really make sure that audio is clear. STIPA is Speech Transmission Index for public address systems, and they're testing for this in a lot of jurisdictions. What they call the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, might require this, so be aware for your school. And there is a little video, if I can get this to play, that I was going to show you an economical way to do this.
Studio 6 Digital is happy to introduce a new cost-effective way to easily measure speech intelligibility using the industry standard STIPA method for users that do not need all the advanced features of our STIPA Pro product. Both STIPA Basic and STIPA Pro are available as in-app purchases in Audio Tools from Studio 6 Digital. Audio Tools is available on the iTunes App Store. STIPA Basic includes all of the required functionality to test speech intelligibility quickly and easily, and fully complies with the latest V4 revision of the STI standard. The STIPA Basic module of audio tools is perfect for testing PA, warning, or speaker-based alarm systems for compliance with fire codes, as well as testing speech intelligibility in schools, venues, or places of worship of all sizes. This is the interface you will see when opening the module. The measured STI is shown in the STI field. A colored rating from U to A+, as described in the V4 STI standard, is shown underneath the STI results field. A Run button is displayed next, which will allow you to measure the STI. Clicking on the wrench icon will let you specify the input source, as well as reload signal files from our server if need be. You have the option of playing the STIPA test signal either from within the STIPA Basic module, or by playing back the signal independently from a laptop, CD player, or other iPhone, iPod, or iPad. The signal is available to download or play from our website, studio6digital.com. Taking the measurement is easy. Simply start the specialized STIPA test signal, move to the place in the room where STI is to be measured, and press Run. Wait for the blue progress bar to finish. The measured STI will be presented in the STI field, and the STI category will also be displayed. For more advanced features, including detailed octave band results, averaging, more measurement options, and the ability to save, recall, and export measurements, check out the STIPA Pro module.
Okay, so some of the high-end gear for folks that are doing this stuff that needs to be calibrated and calibrated to a verifiable source, those can be quite expensive. The company NTI makes some really high-end gear for that. Be up to individual schools if they can afford that or need it. But I definitely want to give a plug for NTI gear. Just I'm not getting paid by them or anything, but really versatile. A lot of their signal generators. Okay, apparently I got muted. I don't know where it was, but anyways, plug for NTI, great equipment. All right, so I want to move into DSPs, digital signal processors. So it's been around for a while. You remember back in the days, if you wanted to do parametric equalization and clamping and clipping and filters and anything you were doing with audio, each thing was a several rack unit piece of gear. So you could take up, a pretty good sized rack to do what today we can do with one rack unit. Here's Biamp's Nexia. We use quite a few of these in our larger rooms, and they can do what a whole rack full of equipment can do. But knowing how to set that up and knowing how to modify it and is kind of a very unique skill set. And as we were talking earlier about getting into the total equipment database, where you need to know what software, what version of software, the passwords to get in there, the IP addresses. But then once you get into the nice little box, how do I go about adjusting some of these different software functions that affect my audio? A great source for audio training, if you are needing that for you or your staff, I was just going to pass along Synergetic Audio Concepts. They're at prosoundtraining.com. They are almost at every Infocom show, and they do a lot of online training. Pat and Brenda Brown run that, giving them a shout out because they have some of the best training on audio. And if you are dealing with DSPs, I would highly suggest you take their Opt EQ course. And it's 3 days of figuring out how to adjust filters and equalizer settings. Going back to that Nexia box, these are just a handful of things that one rack unit can do for you. So as you can imagine, you can get yourself into trouble real quickly if you're not paying attention to that. All right, so let's move into the last area real quick, the TED, your total equipment database. And this is one of those things, if you can walk away on that commissioning test with this in your hand, your life, the life of your technicians that are out in the field working on this, used to be we were happy to get make, model, and serial number off the people so you could get your warranties, and everybody was happy. But think about it these days, almost everything's got an RJ45 on the back, knowing the parameters, the IP addresses, subnets, gateways, all these things. And you can customize this obviously to what your needs are. Some of your equipment might be on wireless and you need to know, SSIDs, stuff like that. If it's something doing with a studio, patch assignments, and also it's a great time to know what circuit breaker this stuff is plugged into. So your folks out there would really appreciate it if you got all that data. And if you use this as part of your deliverables package, if you will, for your contractors or AV integrators, they'll know ahead of time, okay, we need to provide all this, and some other stuff like firmware, all that really important. Real quick, before we wrap up here, going back to the DSPs, have the integrator make a printout of the settings for you. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I just took this off one of ours. It's probably not very readable, but print those out and hang them in the rack where the DSPs are at, because when your folks are out there troubleshooting to know, okay, yeah, that microphone that's coming in over here is really mixed to these outputs. And for the person with the the software and the know-how, printing that out would take them a minute, and it would save you a lot of time. So that is about wrapping up what I wanted to share with you today. I definitely want to encourage you to go check out AQAV.org, get that $1 membership, download all these wonderful tools that they have, and it'll make your procurement and maintenance going into the future of all your AV gear a lot easier. Appreciate your time, and if we've got time, I'm certainly open to any questions.